Welcome to the Jewish Theological Seminary. JTS is thrilled to be offering this opportunity to hear once again, as you've been here before, from Professor Carol Gilligan. Welcome back to JTS.
Thank you.
Tonight's program is the brainchild of two of our beloved faculty members, Naomi Kalish and Bert Vysotsky, who were both fortunate to have studied with Professor Gilligan. Dr. Vysotsky in the 70s, Dr. Kalish a little more recently, and I want to thank them for together conceiving of this event and bringing it to fruition. Thank you very much. This evening is co-sponsored by the Center for Pastoral Education, where Dr. Kalish serves as its Harold and Carol Wolf Director, and she's also Assistant Professor of Pastoral Education. And it is also co-sponsored by the Finkelstein Center for Religious and Social Studies, where Dr. Vysotsky serves as the Lewis Stein Director. Dr. Vysotsky also directs our Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue and has served on the faculty for many years as the Nathan and Appelman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies. Professor Gilligan, in preparation for this event, I found my well-worn copy of In a Different Voice on my bookshelf. It's moved with me from bookshelf to bookshelf as I moved offices over the decades. Your research had a profound effect on me as a graduate student, impacting my own development as a historian of Jews and Judaism. Your teaching, my teaching and research began to focus more and more on the experience of Jewish women and uncovering their stories, their texts, the artifacts, the traditions, customs of women throughout the ages, to fill out a picture that had been very much told from the perspective of men, and something that I hope has enriched that study of I and my many, many colleagues who did this kind of work with me at that time has been enriched immeasurably. And I thank you for inspiring all of us to think about the impact in various fields of what it means to look at things from the lens of women. So I, along with hundreds of others, both here and on Zoom, are really looking forward to this conversation tonight. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Dr. Kalish. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Schwartz. Thank you, everyone who is joining us this evening, both on Zoom and in the room. I'd like to share a few words of housekeeping before we begin. We will be having a Q&A towards the end of our program. If you are on Zoom, please write your questions in the comments section. If you are in the room, you will be receiving index cards and pencils, and Michael will be roaming the room, collecting the questions, bringing them to Dr. Vysotsky, who will bring them to me. If you are in the room also, we do encourage you to wear your mask, except for those of us who are up here speaking. I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to making this event take place. It's too many people to mention, but numerous offices throughout the Jewish Theological Seminary, our security, our facilities, communications, community engagement, many, many individuals, and I'm grateful for them, as well as to my colleague and friend, Dr. Vysotsky. Are you taking Carol Gilligan's class next semester? That was the question as we came to the conclusion of the spring 2010 course I was taking with psychologist Niobe Way. Everyone was curious. I said to my classmates, I don't think I can. I'm not in a psychology program. But they cleared this up for me. My classmates said, Professor Gilligan welcomes people from diverse disciplinary perspectives as well as professional perspectives. I was still finding my way as a rabbi and as a chaplain in a graduate school program, but they encouraged me. And I found that what they said was absolutely true. It's beyond our time today to read you the titles of the classmates that I sat next to in that class, but just a couple of publications that came from my classmates. The Experience of Scholarship, Aid, and Its Effect on Future Giving. That was so fascinating. The Gendering of Witchcraft in German Witchcraft Trials. That was amazing, and also the use of the listening guide method for historical research, which became very important to me. The experience of people with AIDS and HIV, and listening for their voices. Now, of course, the most near and dear topic was the experience of Jews who entered the field of clinical pastoral education. This was my research topic. One of the most impactful points of my experience of working with you was when you said, pastoral care, isn't that an oxymoron? It took me some time to think about that and understand what you might have meant, and to understand the tension between religious leadership, which is often hierarchical, and a caring model, which I had entered a field of caregiving. So it took me a while, and this is what I so much appreciated about what I learned sitting in your class, was the pushing of oneself, the encouraging of oneself and trusting oneself to really come to the edge of what one knows and what one assumes, and coming to the point of curiosity. So when I discovered that Dr. Vysotsky had studied with you too, and learned that he had sat in the lectures and the discussions and debates that you had with Dr. Lawrence Kohlberg, I was in such admiration of his ability, his experience of being present to that, because I said, that was in the years that In a Different Voice was being developed. And how amazing to be present and witness to a process in development. And of course, In a Different Voice made such an impact, and I admired also the process that led to the actual publication and the impact of the text. It's been a joy and a privilege, and I'm tremendously grateful to have been your student for the last several years, and to be in conversation with you. And I'm so excited to hear from you this evening about how some of your thinking has evolved in these years, and that your career has continued to go to that edge of knowing and assuming and understanding. Psychologist Carol Gilligan revolutionized her field, the field of psychology's understanding of gender, with the publication I've already mentioned in 1982, which came after the paper publication of In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. Her voice, as you've heard, her theory has informed fields far beyond the field of psychology, as well as in the arts and STEM and beyond and beyond. And without further ado, I am thrilled for us to begin this conversation. What I'd like to start with, thinking about where we are this evening at the Jewish Theological Seminary, this has been a significant year in Jewish history, with the 100th anniversary of the bat mitzvah of Judith Kaplan Eisenstein.
Oh my goodness.
And you and I have had some discussions and have shared with me some of your reflections of your own Jewish background and its significance to you as you think about your research and your scholarship. And I'd love to hear more.
Well, thank you, Naomi. I mean, you can imagine how thrilling it is to be here with Naomi, my former student. And then Bert reminds me he was my student in a prehistoric era. because I remember Bert in a very different context. But I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be here tonight and to talk in this format. And I realized that I wanted to start by talking about something that really was a discovery for me in recent years, which was the convergence of my writing, which started with In a Different Voice, 45 years, the article that appeared in the Harvard Ed Review in 1977, and 40 years for the publication of the book, which Chancellor Schwartz mentioned, which was 1982. The convergence between my writing In a Different Voice and About Voice and my Jewish identity and education. And the interesting thing to me is that I wasn't aware of this. And I think it's extremely interesting, and as I was thinking about doing this, I mean, the spirit of my mother is very present because she was really responsible. My parents were first-generation Americans. Four of my grandparents immigrated to this country in the end of the 19th century. And they were, with the exception of my mother's father, they were really secular Jews. Very, very proud to be Americans. My mother's father was a really religious person who lived with God, but that's a separate story. But that means that my parents were not raised with a Jewish education. They were raised as first-generation Americans. And I was a child during the years when the Holocaust was going on. And my mother thought that it was very important for me to know, especially given that, what it meant to be Jewish. So she went around to Hebrew schools in New York City, which is where I was born and raised. And the school that drew her was SAJ, the Hebrew school at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, and largely because of Judith Kaplan Eisenstein, because of her, it's not only was Mordecai Kaplan on the Bima at that time, but Judith was a very vivid presence in the Hebrew school, which was, and what drew my mother, was filled with music and ritual and the Hebrew language. And so I went to Hebrew school 3 times a week, and I still remember every year Judith and Ira, her husband who was the rabbi, they would write a cantata for Shavuot every year, and we in the Hebrew school would sing it. And you probably don't know Judith Eisenstein. I mean, I remember her at the piano. I mean, and she was a serious musicologist. And so she insisted that we, the children of the Hebrew school, were as serious about music as she was. So she would sit at the piano with her pack of Chesterfields on the keyboard. And I mean, it was terrifying in some ways. But I still remember the music from those cantatas. And that's actually how I learned about the Holocaust, because it must have been in maybe 43 or 44 that one of the cantatas was about the Baal Shem Tov and about Jews hiding in the forests of Eastern Europe. And this, I mean, it was an extraordinary Jewish education. And I went 3 times a week, and we learned Hebrew. Not only that, I loved the Hebrew language. So I then continued and studied modern Hebrew with a woman whom my mother found. But so anyway, that was very much part of my childhood. Totally, has been part of my identity. And it didn't occur to me to make the connection until really very, very recently. And it was when Yehuda Sarna, the rabbi of NYU, invited me to become involved again with American Judaism. And I started to think, every night my mother would have me, when she was putting me to bed, I would recite the Shema. So come on, hear, listen, voice. I mean, you know, it doesn't take a lot to see. I was raised in a tradition about listening and voice, not images. I mean, you can think about how much social science is about perception and observation and so forth. And here I come out of a tradition about voice. I mean, that's what I grew up with. So just very, very, very briefly, there were I remember reading at some point in Robert Alter's description in his book, The Narrative Art of the Hebrew Bible, and that the ancient Hebrew writers had to create a narrative art in order to convey, I think this is a pretty accurate quote, a view of human life as lived in the changing medium of time, under God, meaning reflexively, inexorably and perplexingly, this is Alter, in relationship with others, which was, of course, it was that narrative voice and narrative art that I brought into a field specifically of moral philosophy that was much more influenced by Plato and eternal principles and so forth and so on. So, and the third voice that contributed to this was Cynthia Ozick in her piece on Notes Toward Asking the Right Question. And her whole piece, if you haven't read it, you really should, was about what is the question to ask when you realize that basically half the population, that is women, were not included in the tradition. And her question was, what was lost? And that you have to start with mourning what had been lost, that the contributions of half of the Jewish population were not incorporated into the tradition. So anyway, it's very moving to me to be here tonight because the one piece I've left out is when I first, the connection between my Jewish background and my work was when 3 women showed up at NYU from a group called Women Wage Peace in Israel. I don't know if you know about that group, including Donna Kirschbaum, who's a Reconstructionist rabbi. And it turned out that she had written that group that united women, Palestinian and Israeli and religious and secular, and women from Tel Aviv and women from, the what do they call communities on the periphery more. And Donna I didn't know her, but she had used my work as the basis for answering the question, why women and why now? So she was making the connection. And then when Yehuda Sarna, so I was involved with Women Wage Peace. I was one of 4 women who spoke at the Journey to Reconciliation for Jewish and Muslim women to reconcile as the daughters of Sarah and Hagar. And it was an incredible march into the Judean desert. And I was one of 4 women. There was a Palestinian woman, and an Arab Israeli woman, and a Jewish woman, and we all spoke at that event. And then when Yehuda Sarna invited me to co-lead with Eli Stern from Yale, I keep forgetting the name of this group, but so I wrote it down so I could say it to you. The Applied Research Collective for American Jewry, which was run out of the Bronfman Center. And that was an extraordinary experience. And that really brought me back into direct connection with the American Jewish community. So I'm delighted to be here. And now you can hear, as I hear, that very strong resonance between my work and my Jewish education and Jewish identity.
I'm curious if you have thoughts on the fact that this was a recent discovery, and I think in terms of how you understand the place of religion in America, religious identity.
I'll tell you what strikes me more than, at least from my sense. I mean, my children identify as Jewish. My grandchildren have been bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. So my Jewish identity was never, ever in question, and it was certainly nothing that was alien to me or anybody who knew me. but I didn't make the connection with my work. And I think what I take from that is the importance of a really, as I had an extraordinary Jewish education. I mean, the cultural richness of the Hebrew school at SAJ in that time when Judith Kaplan Eisenstein was there. And I mean, it was just infused with a kind of really love of the language and the music and the ritual and the aesthetic of it. You know, I'm always, as a teacher, I always am skeptical about the forms they give out to students to evaluate the education. You know, it always seems to me it's a little bit like, you know, the Campbell Soup Company. Did you like the pea soup or the mushroom soup? That kind of, what did you like? What didn't you like? I think it's a long time sometimes if you really want to evaluate. Because if you wanted to evaluate my Jewish education, you'd have to look many, many years. I mean, what are we, it's how many years? It was 80 years since I probably entered that Hebrew school. And see the profound effect it had on my work, even though it wasn't labeled as such. So that's what I really take from it, is the enormous value of good religious education. And you can't see directly where it's going to go. And the fact that I didn't see it, that's sort of mildly interesting to me, but you know, my mother she'd have something to say about that, but she's not here, so that.
Well, I'm excited knowing that we have several Jewish educators in the room and on Zoom, and maybe we'll come back to this, but you've raised such an important point, evaluation and curriculum and the lived experience of the education. So we've noted a few times that this year marks the 40th anniversary of the publication of the book in a different voice. And can you tell us how your thinking has changed or evolved in the time since its publication?
Well, I mean, just to put it starkly, I've changed my title. I have a book coming out next year, I think, from Polity Press, and it's called In a Human Voice. And it's where my thinking has come to about In a Different Voice. And again, the interesting thing to me is it took me 40 years to come to this. And you'll hear me talk about it. I'm sort of tempted to read to you the opening of the book. But I mean, the realization that's at the core of this book, which pulls together very recent pieces that I've written, including 2 things that I wrote last year, something that I'll talk about more later, 3rd piece. But it's interesting to me how, and I think it tells you about the struggle, I mean, in the best sense of the word, that my work became engaged with, that it took 40 years, let's say, to come to a distillation. My amazing former student, Judy Chu, who I think is on Zoom, part of the Zoom audience, and she really crystallized for me what a kind of crystallization it was. But to come to the realization that the different voice is a human voice. It was heard as a feminine voice, but it's a human voice. The voice it differs from is a patriarchal voice. That means a voice that is bound to a gender binary, things being either masculine or feminine. Reason, you can all do it. What's the gender of reason? Masculine. What's emotion? Feminine. What's the self? Masculine. When you hear a gender binary and a gender hierarchy privileging, in this case, the masculine, you know you're in patriarchy, whatever it's called. In other words, come to a very precise understanding of what that is. So the different voice is a human voice. The voice it differs from is a patriarchal voice. That is a voice you listen for the telltale gender binary and hierarchy. And where patriarchy is enforced or enforced, the human voice is a voice of resistance. And it's around that nugget that this book is written, and the realization, and what led to this realization, and in a sense, what had to happen to kind of hear a voice that was gendered feminine, that is within a patriarchal structure, because there's nothing feminine about caring. I mean, except it's gendered feminine. I mean, in case you didn't notice, and therefore low paid, but anyway, I'm going to just read you the opening because I think you might like it, and then I'll talk a little more about this. In the fall of 1991, I think I'll put on my glasses, the house across the street from mine was being painted, and the painters brought their radio to work each day, placing it alongside them on the scaffold. At the time, the United States Senate Judiciary Committee, acting under pressure, had called Professor Anita Hill to testify about the nomination of Clarence Thomas for Supreme Court Justice. The radio was turned up loud, and Anita Hill's voice was riveting. The calm, steady sound of her speaking flowed down the street like a river, and then her voice was filtered through the responses of the senators. I remember the two-step process of listening to Anita Hill, hearing her, and then hearing her not being heard. At the time, I began writing in a different voice. This is for Bert, because he was there. Women's voices were conspicuously missing from the psychology I was teaching, or rather, women's voices were inconspicuously missing. And the inconspicuousness of an omission so huge as to be monumental, women are, after all, more than half the population, was in part what led me to write. But to be honest, what spurred me more was a growing awareness of how readily a woman would not be heard or would be misunderstood, especially when she gave voice to what she knew on the basis of her own experience, or said what she, quote, really thought. Within a different voice, I broke a silence, my silence. What I did not know at the time was that it wasn't just my silence. The year is 1973. President Nixon has ended the Vietnam War draft, and the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade has legalized abortion. I'm teaching part-time at Harvard. My PhD is in psychology, and since receiving my degree in 1964, I have taught with Erik Erikson and also with Lawrence Kohlberg. In fact, it was the inspiration of their work that drew me back into the field of psychology. Still, I was the mother of 3 young children, a modern dancer, and active in the civil rights and the anti-war movements. As an undergraduate at Swarthmore, I had majored in English literature, and perhaps it was this, in part, that spurred my interest in how people think about themselves and about morality when they are facing real situations of conflict and choice. I was interested in questions of identity and morality, or as Larry Kohlberg put it at the time, in the relationship between judgment and action. And so, noticing a reticence among the men in the discussion section of Kohlberg's course on moral and political choice that I was leading, their outspokenness when it came to talking about the Vietnam War, which most considered unjust, but their silence when the subject became whether or not one should resist the draft, a choice which upon graduation many of them would actually face, I decided to follow these students and interview them when they were college seniors and the draft decision was upon them. And then President Nixon ended the draft. So it was that the locus of my study shifted. I was looking for a situation where people have to make a choice, where issues of identity and morality are at stake, and where they will have to live with the consequences of their decision. Real versus hypothetical moral dilemmas. And the Supreme Court came to my aid. Roe v. Wade, 1973. My study would focus on abortion decisions, where people would come to a public place, pregnancy counseling clinics, and the decision would be made within a limited time frame. At the time, it didn't strike me that the participants in the draft decision study were men, and in the abortion decision study were women. My interest was in identity and moral development. Between 1973 and 1975, together with Mary Belenke, then a graduate student at Harvard and also my neighbor and friend, I interviewed 29 women who were in the first trimester of a confirmed pregnancy and who were considering abortion. The women were referred to our study from street front clinics in Boston's South End, from pregnancy counseling services, preterm and Planned Parenthood, and from university counseling services. Some teenagers especially, were referred by counselors who were concerned about repeated abortions. Some came because they themselves were unsure about the decision and welcomed the opportunity to talk, and some because they wanted to contribute to research. The women ranged in age from 15 to 33 and were diverse in race, ethnicity, and social class. Of the 29 women, 4 decided to have the baby, 2 miscarried, 21 chose to have an abortion, and 2 were undecided at the time of the interview and could not be contacted at the time of the follow-up study. Of the 29 women referred to the study, complete interview data were available for 24, and of these 24, 21 were interviewed again at the end of the year following choice. In the winter of 1975-76, my husband and I had moved from one suburb of Boston to another. For our 3 children, it was like moving from one world to another, because for them it meant new schools, new friends, and a new neighborhood to get used to. I stayed home that year to help them adjust to the change. I had a small research stipend to support the abortion decision study, and during the days when the children were in school, I would read through the interviews that Mary and I had conducted. It was during that winter, on a day that remains etched in my memory, that my friend Dora Gilligan came over. She was a graduate student studying psychology at Harvard, also interested in moral development. We were in the kitchen where I had been reading through the interview transcripts, and I said, I understand why psychologists have so much trouble understanding women. At the time, I was teaching and she was studying the theories of Freud and Erikson, Piaget and Kohlberg, all of whom had confessed to being puzzled by women, whom they observed to be this is history, Chancellor Schwann, less developed than men, both in their sense of self and their capacity for moral judgment. According to Freud, women have less sense of justice than men, and women tend to score lower than men, typically at stage 3 on Kohlberg's 6-stage scale of moral development. To Erikson, women fuse or confuse identity with intimacy. Piaget observed that in contrast to boys, girls give priority to relationships over rules. Reading through the interviews with women, listening in particular for how they spoke about themselves and about morality, I heard a tendency to construct moral problems differently. That is, to start, as it were, from a different place, from an assumption of connectedness rather than separateness. I said some such thing to Dora, and she said, "That's interesting. Why don't you write about it?" And that's the origin of In a Different Voice. First, the 1977 Harvard Ed Review article, and then the 82 book. The abortion decision study was the impetus for the article and the centerpiece of the book, The focus of its 2 central chapters, Chapter 3, Concepts of Self and Morality, and Chapter 4, Crisis and Transition. Yet as far as I'm aware of, my research here has been on Google. Despite all the talk about In a Different Voice, there has been a radio silence around the abortion decision study. It's almost never mentioned, and if mentioned, almost exclusively by me. So that's the opening of In a Human Voice. And, if we had world enough and time, I would go on and tell you the fate of what happened when a student took it to the Harvard Ed Review, the article, and it was rejected. But that's another story.
I look forward to us coming back in the Q&A. It's hard to shift at this point. I'm always interested in the story behind the story, and I think there is real significance in hearing you today and your forthcoming book, to hear the process that led to the discovery, both your listening as well as that conversational, dialogical process with your friend.
I mean, what's really interesting to me, just the short kind of thing, is a voice which by me and by others was heard as a feminine voice. I mean, to say a voice of care ethics is heard as a feminine voice tells you you are in a culture that is gendering human capacities. So caring was feminine and justice was masculine and so forth and so on. But what I didn't realize was the whole context in which I was working, and the context of the psychology that I was teaching it was not named, but it was patriarchal. And so the idea that what was heard in that context as a feminine voice, now 40 years later, with all the intervening research and the relational shift in the human sciences, it's clearly recognized as a human voice. And here, my research on girls was critical, because it said that what had been considered development was more accurately named initiation. And that's a whole story, and that's a story that's told in my book. But at that point, you hear it's a human voice, and that the gender issue is really, it's in that sense, it's an issue about patriarchy. And that the human voice is in fact a voice of resistance to a structure that in fact elevates some humans over other humans and also genders human capacities and so forth. Anyway, but there's a third part that I really specifically want to talk with you about, so I'm going to let Naomi go to there so I can do this, and then we can really talk.
I know, as you've shared with us and as we've discussed, you've studied and been a student of Jewish text. And I'm curious, as you've listened to Jewish texts, what you've heard that lends itself or articulates a theme of resistance.
All right, so this was the biggest surprise of all. I mean, you know that I didn't realize it was my Jewish education that was playing out through my work. I didn't realize that a voice that sounded feminine was a human voice. And here is the thing that was the most startling to me. And it starts with the fact that in addition to my book, In a Human Voice, which is how I think now about the work that started within a different voice, I also have written a second novel, which should be coming out roughly, maybe a little later, but around the same time. And the novel is about a woman who is a dancer. That's interesting to me because I'm very interested in how we register experience in our bodies. And I wanted someone who didn't really use words so much, but processed her experience in her body. And when you write fiction, you work associatively, and my characters come with their names. You know their names. And my character's name is Eve. And after a while, it did occur to me to ask Eve, what's this? So here we go. I had to then, that led me back to, of course, the Garden of Eden story, which I thought I knew. But there on the page right in front of me was something I had overlooked that changed my way of seeing the first woman. It disrupted the story that I thought I knew. And then in the spring of 2017, I was told something about the creation of the first woman that struck me as totally improbable and yet profoundly true. This was a disruption at a much deeper level. So it's really a privilege to be able to talk about this here. It will be in my book, but I would love your responses to this. I'm going to start with the story. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. Actually, she's called the woman until just as they are about to leave the garden. Adam names her Chava, or Eve, from the Hebrew word chaya, meaning life, because the Bible explains she is the one who will bring forth life. She will be the mother. But that's not where it starts. The story begins with the serpent, the quote, most cunning of all the beasts in the field, who asked the woman, can you eat from all the trees in the garden? And she says, yes, all but the one in the center, and if we eat from that tree or touch the fruit, we will die. And the serpent tells her, no, you won't die. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. We know this is a story about forbidden knowledge, about temptation and transgression, man and woman. What I hadn't known, what I literally hadn't seen or taken in, is what follows the interchange between the woman and the serpent. The woman now has been told two conflicting things. You will die, you will not die. So what does she do? She looks at the tree. She's not the dupe of the serpent or seduced by the prospect of being as gods. In the face of conflicting authorities and truths, she decides to see for herself, and she acts on her own perceptions. Here's the King James Version. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. In Robert Alter's 2019 translation, quote, and the woman saw that the tree was good for eating, and that it was lust to the eyes, and the tree was lovely to look at, and she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her man with her, and he ate. Essentially the same. This could be the story of any woman, or every woman, or for that matter, anyone, who, seeing a fruit that is good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and a source of nourishment or wisdom, like fish, if you consider fish brain food, takes it and eats it. And then, and when nothing happens, no one dies, no one feels ashamed or moves to cover their nakedness, gives it to the person who was with them. An ordinary story. But once Adam has eaten the fruit, that's when the story shifts. Suddenly, they are hiding from God and using fig leaves to cover their nakedness. When in the cool of the evening God comes into the garden, he calls not for the woman, but for Adam. And then the blaming starts. Adam blames the woman blames the serpent. God punishes them for their transgression. To the woman he says, quote, and for your man shall be your longing, and he shall rule over you. To Adam he says, I love this, because you listened to the voice of your wife and disobeyed my commandments. Cursed be the soil for your sake. With pangs shall you eat from it all the days of your life. Or, that's Alter, in the more familiar King James translation, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of your life. That story also we know, the story of it was all her fault. But here's what truly astonished me. In 2017, I was invited to speak at the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, by women members from the center and center-left parties. The session was held in the conference room of the Knesset building in Jerusalem, and about 150 people, mostly women, were invited to attend. In the question period following my talk, one of the women, an international human rights lawyer asked me, "Have you heard of Ezer Kenegdo?" No, I had no idea what she was talking about. She translated the Hebrew words. Ezer means helper, though not in the sense of a servant or subordinate, because God is an Ezer, someone who has the power to help. And Kenegdo means by opposing him. Confronting is another translation, according to my friend, the Israeli philosopher Moshe Halbertal. It means to be opposite someone, to face them, or as the woman lawyer said that day in Jerusalem, to pull them in an opposite direction. Ezer Kenegdo is from the book of Genesis, from this second creation story, where God creates Adam, the earthling, the human, because God needs someone to till the soil. Seeing that Adam is lonely, God creates the animals to keep him company. But then God sees that this is not sufficient. What Adam needs, God sees, is an Ezer Kenegdo, someone who will help him by opposing him. And so God creates woman. I was stunned. How come we don't know this? Or maybe you do. How come I didn't know this? And in one sense, the answer is clear. Negdo is not translated. It's simply left out. Helpmeet is the King James translation. Helpmate is an alternative. No whiff of opposition. The New English Bible says, quote, partner. Robert Alter translates Ezer Kenegdo as sustainer beside him, adding in a footnote that the Hebrew phrase Ezer Kenegdo is, quote, notoriously difficult to translate. Although why this is so remains a mystery. A law student in my seminar on resisting injustice, a Hebrew speaker from Australia, had no trouble translating the words. In his footnote, Alter writes that negdo means, quote, alongside him, opposite him, a counterpart to him. It's the notion of opposition that gets lost, as if it were inconceivable that the words could mean what on the face of it they mean. Or more to the point, impossible to think that man, the human, needed a woman to help him by opposing him, or confronting him, or challenging him, or questioning him, or facing him, or pulling him in a direction opposite to the one where, left to himself, he most likely would go. And whatever God said this, whoever wrote the words, Ezer Kenegdo, into the story of woman's creation, that voice could not be listened to, in contrast to the familiar story of seduction and disobedience. Because truly, what man or what God could even conceive that a man, a human, would need a woman to help him in this way? There's nothing difficult about the words themselves. Ezer, or for that matter, negdo, an ordinary word, neged. In everyday Hebrew, it means against, and with the O, against him or it, like a team in basketball playing against another team. It's the concept of a woman's opposition being helpful to men that is, quote, notoriously difficult to stomach. Yet somebody, some ancient sage, left tracks, footprints in the sand. To follow these tracks then leads to a very different reading of the Adam and Eve story, and also, I would say, theories of self and morality and development. Because in this reading, the woman, an afterthought in this conception of the world, sees where things are heading when knowledge of good and evil belongs solely to a Lord God on high, and man is barred from grasping what is in nature, as a tree is in nature, including in his own nature. In short, somewhere, someone long ago saw that under these conditions, the human would need someone to pull him in an opposite direction, away from the path that will lead to the woman becoming subjugated to him, out of the story that ends with, quote, and he shall rule over her, where he is the human and she is the mother. In short, the patriarchal story. I am riveted by these traces of an alternative story, set down long ago and then eclipsed by what we have come to know as, quote, the story. Why, we may wonder, does this insight into a man's needs have to be covered? When I came upon a passage in one of Toni Morrison's novels explaining why, I realized that I wasn't the only woman for whom this is no secret. The passage in question is from Beloved. It's about Paul D's relationship to Setha, the mother of Beloved. Speaking in the voice of Paul D, who like Setha had been a slave, Morrison writes, Setha, she's fixed me and I can't break it. Then, tracking Paul D's thoughts, Morrison continues, what? A grown man fixed by a girl? And fucking her or not was not the point. It was not being able to stay in her house or go where he wishes. The danger was in losing Setha, because he was not man enough to break out. So he needed her, Setha, to help him, to know about it, and it shamed him to have to ask the woman he wanted to protect to help him do it. God damn it to hell. Because, as had been said just a few lines earlier, quote, he was a man, and a man could do what he would. Because his needing Setha to know about it and to help him break out or to fix it shamed him, it made him not a man. So here we are. This is the story we need to disrupt, and do so before it is too late. If we ask what Paul D needed Setha to help him break out from and what he needed her to fix, Morrison's novel answers the question. Paul D needed Setha to help him break out of the emotional lockdown that besets a man in patriarchy. The conception of manhood that forces Paul D in Morrison's haunting image to carry his tears locked up inside him in, quote, that tobacco tin buried in his chest where a red heart used to be, its lid rusted shut, end quote. For Paul D to break out or break that tin open, to fix it, meant to experience the shame he would feel in experiencing emotions that would cause him to believe, quote, I am not a man, which in truth is what he wants to tell Setha, but cannot bring himself to say. Let me be very clear what I am and am not saying. In the book of Genesis, there are two creation stories. In the one told at the very outset in Genesis 1, God creates the world in 6 days, starting with heaven and earth and ending with humans. Quote, male and female created he them. No hierarchy, no either or binary. Just humans, male and female. It could be a spectrum. In the second creation story, Genesis 2, on the day the Lord God, for now he is called Lord God, both in the King James and by Alter, on the day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, he fashioned the human from the soil, humus, or in Hebrew, adamah, and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, so there would be someone to till the soil. In contrast to Genesis 1, this creation story is a patriarchal story. In the beginning, the Lord God creates Adam, the earthling who is man. Initially, there is no thought of woman, but then God sees that Adam is lonely. You know how it goes, and this in turn leads to the recognition that what Adam needs is an ezer kenegdo. So God puts Adam to sleep, and out of his side creates an ezer kenegdo for him. That is, he creates woman. What I'm saying is that embedded within this second patriarchal creation story is a story of resistance to patriarchy, along with the insight that Adam will need to resist patriarchy, and like Paul D, will need someone to help him do it. So there are, in effect, three creation stories. The first creation story in Genesis 1, male and female created he them. The second creation story in Genesis 2, where God creates Adam, man, and what follows is directed by man's needs, that is, the patriarchal story. And then within the patriarchal story is a resistance story where God creates woman to help Adam resist patriarchy. It's not that she's right and he's wrong. Rather, it is, as Toni Morrison sees, that he needs her to help him do what he cannot do on his own because he is a man. That is, he needs someone who is not a man to oppose what, as a man, he cannot break out of or fix without calling his manhood into question, the lockdown of his heart. There are many ways to read the story of woman made from Adam's rib, but in my reading, the words Ezer Kenegdo are the tip-off. What strikes me is that some wise person way back then saw that within this patriarchal conception of the world, Adam, the man, will be vulnerable in a way that will lead him to need a helper who is strong, an Ezer, and who, seeing where this is heading, into hiding and covering, blaming and shaming, punishment and suffering, entrapment and domination, will help him by pulling him in an opposite direction. Someone, a woman, a being, a human, who is not foreign to him, but who is created out of a side of himself, someone in touch with his humanity. The French newspaper Libération ran an illustration alongside an interview with me about the French translation of my book with Naomi Snyder, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? The illustration answers the question because it shows a man blinded, unable to see that he is about to walk off a cliff, and a woman bracing herself, a gag over her mouth, seeing what is about to happen, but not able to say what she sees. In its primary colors, the illustration has an elementary feel, something we know on a foundational level, like primary education, before secondary education sets in, and we learn how we are supposed to see and to speak about the world, including what we are not to see or to say. To put it in Ferenczi's terms, before we confuse a patriarchal voice with our own. In the layered creation story in the book of Genesis, the patriarchal story is an overlay. It displaces an earlier story about humans and contains within itself the seeds of its undoing. The agent of this disruption is a woman, and in this light it makes sense that the, quote, different voice was heard as a woman's voice, or a, quote, feminine voice. With the disruption now spreading through the human sciences in the form of a paradigm shift or relational turn, relational capacities such as empathy and emotional intelligence are recognized as human strengths. Now the different voice can be heard for what it is, a human voice, our voice in the beginning, a voice that joins thinking and feeling, self and relationship, mind and body. And with this realization comes the recognition that separations once hailed as milestones of progress, the separation of reason from emotion, mind from body, the self from relationships, are in fact manifestations of injury or trauma. That's it.
Thank you. I'd like to take a moment to absorb the just wonderful insights. So we have some questions, and without further ado, let me begin. Where do you hope the Jewish community will grow vis-a-vis ethics of care, an ethic of care?
You know, I feel like there are people in this room, first of all, who can answer, or are in a position to answer, and Bert, really to answer that question more than me. I mean, because it starts with, I mean, you know, it's like, what is it? Once you recognize the different voice as a human voice, the ethic of care is an ethic of liberation. I mean, it's an ethic of resistance to moral injury. Then you think, well, the different voice is the voice for the 21st century. So I'd love to see the Jewish community take the lead. That's what I would like. I mean, it's so, I mean, what I just read, this is me. I mean, you know, gosh, it feels like an act of what, sort of great hubris to come to JTS and me, read Breshit to you. I mean, you know, but I'm saying this is in our tradition. And it was the reason I highlight Alter along with, you know, I mean, in the Dutch translation, it's called helper. It's like there's a wisdom in our tradition that really would speak directly to why the ethic of care at this moment in history. I mean, it's like, it's crucial. That's a human voice. So.
I am curious, in your shift in language from a different voice to a human voice, what hopes you have for how that language will land more broadly?
It's saying the seeds of resistance are in all of us. I mean, it was not like we have to import them.
Okay.
It's a human voice. That's where we all begin. So if we meet a human, I mean, people say to me, we want to help girls find their voices. I say, girls have their voices. They do. I said, but I think, do you really want to hear their voices? So if you meet a woman who seemingly has no voice, or a man who seems emotionally clueless, the question is, what happened to this human being? And we have naturalized, basically, what happens, what is the consequence of a process of initiation. So I find this work very hopeful because it says the seeds of resistance are in all of us. And so the question that the project I'm involved in right now with my students at NYU is called radical listening. It's how do you hear that voice? Because, just to say it very simply, at a certain point in development, with this initiation into this patriarchal, into the gender binary and hierarchy, which then, I'll say but what happens is a human voice goes undercover. And it's covered by a voice that sounds like people's voices. And that's the process. I spent 10 years in a different voice studying girls. And then with Judy Chu, who then took that work on and wrote this amazing book called When Boys Become, quote, Boys, or How Boys Are Often Said to Be. And my student Niobe Way, who did this amazing study of adolescent boys and their friendships called Deep Secrets, Boys' Friendships and the Crisis of Connection. And these are amazing books, When Boys Become Boys and Deep Secrets. And Deep Secrets, by the way, was the inspiration for a film which won the second prize at Cannes, and it's going to open in New York in January. And very likely will be a contender for the Oscar, called Close, which is really when a human voice gets covered. And we have mistaken the cover voice for people's voices. And anyway, so what is this saying is, I have found, and what's really interesting to me right now in the work I'm doing now, is if you question the cover voice, how accessible that under voice actually is. And that's a surprise. It doesn't take 7 years of psychoanalysis. No, it is.
Okay, let's continue. How can a caring degender justice? Should that be something to which we aspire, or is justice the wrong paradigm?
What's the question?
It's how can caring degender justice? Should that be something to which we aspire, or is justice the wrong paradigm?
Well, if you think about development, as children, there are two things that are just facts about human experience. Excuse me. As children, we are born smaller than adults. So we are very vulnerable to basically the misuses of power. There are the abuses of power. And also, as children, we only survive if somebody takes care of us. So there are two cries you hear from children. I can do it in English, but I'm sure you can find it in other languages. And you all know them. The child's appeal to morality is, first of all, it's not fair. It's an appeal to justice. That's not fair. You're using power unfairly. You're abusing power. You're using power to oppress. And the other cry from children, you don't care. So, in other words, morality, I wrote a paper with a former student called Grant Wiggins, and it was called The Origins of Morality in Early Childhood Relationships. That, you know, in any human situation, there's going to be concerns about justice and concerns about caring. And frankly, to say that women don't care about justice is preposterous. I mean, this is ridiculous. Of course we care about fairness. Of course we care about the abuses of power. Of course we care about oppression. To say that men don't care about abandonment, I mean, you've got to be kidding. I mean, you know, they'll kill a woman who leaves them. I mean, it's honestly, it's so justice and care are built into the human life cycle. The question is, how did they become gendered? You know, and that's really an interesting question. How do women learn to not care about justice? How do men act as if they don't care? I mean, that's it. This is really turning the development, the field of questions about morality on their head. Because when you actually think about them, I mean, if you think about them in relation to experience, to what we know from experience, it doesn't make any sense. It's like saying that men think and women feel. That's one of the most inane things one could probably say. The amazing thing is people say it. I mean, the idea that men don't feel and women don't think, I mean, that's crazy. So, anyway.
You know, I'm looking at the question again and listening to you, and I'm wondering if a different question could be, how can we degender caring and justice?
How can we see them as human concerns?
Right.
Well, that's by moving out of patriarchy, because they're not gendered intrinsically. But what is this? Oh, I know what I wanted to say before about patriarchy. The minute you assume what now is taken as fact, really, across the human sciences. I mean, you can quote Franz de Waal, empathy is not a recent acquisition, it's an age-old human capacity. What is Franz de Waal said? That all the assumptions about human nature have to be reconsidered now. Because what we know, and we know this from the studies of babies, is that right from the beginning, as humans, we are inherently relational, responsive beings. I mean, these extraordinary studies. Just watch Ed Tronick's study, the still face experiment. 2 minutes, the mother becomes unresponsive, and this 1-year-old baby instantly picks it up, first moves to repair the rupture in the relationship, and then when the mother stays unresponsive, it's only 2 minutes. Everybody has 2 minutes to watch. I show it at the beginning of my classes. The baby freaks out. I mean, so at 1-year-old, we know the difference between when somebody's in relationship with us and somebody's not in relationship with us. And we come into this world both desiring and with the rudiments of the capacity to engage responsively with other people. Excuse me. If you want to set up an order of living where some human beings are considered superior to other human beings, whether on the basis of gender or race or sexuality or class or caste or whatever, these human relational capacities are a problem. Because the person on top will feel the feelings of the person on the bottom, and the person on the bottom will have a voice. So you have to stunt or limit or basically shame these relational capacities if you want to maintain systems of injustice. So that's really what's at stake here. And one way you do it is you start gendering them, and then you shame men for feeling feelings that are gendered feminine. I mean, there's an extraordinary passage in Anna Karenina, if you're readers of Tolstoy, where in the middle, Karenin suddenly gains access to tender compassion, to human feelings, this seeming automaton. And he realizes that they seem to him natural and good, but he'd learned to see them as a shameful weakness, as bad and improper. So the work on girls that I did with my students, the Harvard Project on women's psychology and girls' development, as girls reach adolescence, you start to hear girls say, I don't know. It's like the word don't has come between I and no. And they start to hear an honest voice, that is the voice that says what they actually feel, or what they really think, or what they would say if they were, quote, to be quite honest. They start to hear that voice as, quote, rude or stupid or crazy, as opposed to learning what other people want them to see or want them to feel. I mean, girls are very good at that, and saying what people want them to say. So that's the under voice and the cover voice. And boys start to hear an emotionally intelligent voice as babyish or girly or gay. So, I mean, what you have is this shaming of human capacities that drive a human voice underground, basically. And the interesting thing and the hopeful thing to me is if you question the cover voice, that voice is more accessible than you would think. But you have to be prepared to hear it and not shame it.
Thanks. Okay. This is a fun question. What was the most unusual application of it in a different voice to analyze another field?
That is a great question. I mean, what's the furthest afield it went? Oh, my goodness. You know, it's hard for me to say what's the. I read you the opening of my book to tell you I thought it was just me trying to make sense of my own situation. Bert can describe the situation. He was there. I mean, it didn't. I realized it was my silence. I was a really good student. I knew exactly what people wanted me to. I knew to listen before I talked to figure out what you're supposed to say. It's a good way to get A's in school. I mean, I really did, and so forth. The idea of saying what I really thought, I mean, the voice in my head that led me to write in a different voice was a voice that said, if you want to know what I think. And I wrote the book because I was convinced that no one was interested, so it seemed like I wrote it for myself. That's what I did. It was the first thing I ever wrote that wasn't for school. I had no idea that my experience was shared by other women. I think that that was the most extraordinary discovery for me, that it wasn't just me. And I started to understand and also appreciate my own silences. I mean, why I was reluctant to speak until I had a good sense of what sort of where I was and what you were supposed to say, because, I mean, I remember now, it seems rather absurd to me, but I had 3 little children. I was teaching with Erickson. The course was on the human life cycle, so it was about child development. So I put my 3 children to bed. That was already difficult, you know. And then I would have to read these books to find out what you're supposed to say about mothers and young children, because if I drew on my own experience, I would get it wrong. So, I mean, I had learned this. And I think that was the real surprise to me. And then to think, wait a minute, this is a human voice, and it's not just a woman's voice, it's a human voice. So it's not a question of women versus men. It's a question of how do we lose touch with our humanity? That's
it's interesting. The far afield, it's like in a different voice, was already taking the field of psychology to a new place. And so in that sense, it seems like the applications, I'm thinking both of in a different voice as well as the listening guide method that you use for analyzing and understanding interview data is on a journey with this process. But the leap or the dramatic step was already taken.
I think that's true.
Yeah. So here's another question. Can you speak about how your thinking was shaped by your relationship with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks?
Good Lord. There's an old Piaget thing. I always start my course on listening by assigning, there's a beautiful Piaget essay on method at the beginning of Child's Conception of the World. And he gives us a wonderful illustration of how you have to get out of your own frame of mind. When the child, if you ask the child what makes what makes the sun move or whatever, I mean, that's assuming that the child thinks the sun moves. I mean, I can't remember the exact Piaget, but why do you think I was influenced by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs? I mean, I don't really know him. I did one program with him at the 92nd Street Y. We had a really interesting conversation, but he's not somebody I really know. I mean, I could talk about how I was influenced by a lot of people, but he would not be on my list. That doesn't say anything about him. I spent one evening with him on the stage of the 92nd Street Y, and we had a real conversation.
I was there for that conversation. So here's another question. To what do you attribute the fact that all, and all is in quotation marks, societies have built some kind of gender hierarchy if this is not true?
I'm not sure that that's true, that the premise is true. Mm-hmm. I mean, all societies have to deal with the sexual dimorphism. I mean, yes, there's some variations, and so how societies construct gender, but to construct gender in terms of a binary and a hierarchy, you could say patriarchy is a near universal. I think this is not my area. Maybe I want to look at historians, right? I mean, there are different theories about where that is. I would say that, if you want to set up a hierarchy and have some humans as superior to other humans, what you have to do is you have to shame these relational capacities because they're going to get in your way. And so to the extent that being a man, Judy Chu says it very clearly in her book, When Boys Become, quote, boys, when masculinity becomes defined as the opposite of or in opposition to femininity. So whatever is feminine is not masculine. And sort of, how does that happen? I mean, because there are other ways to construct it. I think you would find there are societies that don't do that. They would be interesting. I'm looking, help, a historian.
Well, we have another question here, which brings us back to the response you gave earlier when I said, what are your hopes in the change in language? And you spoke about ending patriarchy and moving. So this question is, can you share your thoughts about fostering healthy resistance in children and adolescents in schools? What does this look like in practice?
Oh, sure. That's a question that I can say something about, because if you understand when the initiation takes place. Yeah. So it starts, I'll do, and it will be in my new book, what I call a triptych of initiation. It starts with young boys. I mean, you all know this. The boys between 4 and 7. And the way you know that the times of initiation is there's a sudden high incidence of signs of psychological distress. So with boys, in that transition from early to middle childhood, from preschool to school, this is Judy Chu's work, there's a sudden high incidence of signs of psychological distress. Learning problems, attention problems, speech problems, behavior problems. This is boys. Because at that time, entering school, boys have to establish that they are a real boy, meaning not girly or gay, and one of the boys, so that they're included among the boys. And that means that those human qualities that are gendered feminine, they have to dissociate themselves from. And Judy's work shows that if the 4 and 5-year-olds, I mean, they're amazing. You talk about human qualities. They are attentive, authentic, articulate, and direct with one another and with her. And between 4 and 7, as they move from pre-kindergarten to kindergarten and into first grade, they are gradually becoming more inattentive, more inarticulate, more inauthentic, and more indirect with one another and with her. They are becoming, she says, boys, or how boys are often said to be, but they resist. And her book is a beautiful example of her. So it starts with boys between 4 and 7, so you certainly want to look at what's going on there and how masculinity is being established and defined in your kindergarten class. And then you want to pick up, because this picks up with girls at the time of adolescence. And what's the marker? You have a sudden high incidence among girls who've been fairly hardy up until this point, fairly able to withstand stress. And suddenly, at adolescence, girls, you have this sudden high incidence of depression, which is higher among boys in early signs of depression, that flat affect and so forth. But suddenly, Martin Seligman writes about this, there's a flip-flop, where suddenly there's high rates of depression, and you know the rest. What else? Eating disorders, cutting, I mean, basically self-destructive behavior, like, dropping out of school classes and so forth and so on. And then it picks up again in later adolescence. This is Niobe Way's work with boys, when they are learning, quote, how to become more of a man. In her book, it's extraordinary that she did the study of boys across a great range of studies, across a great range of ethnicity. And at the beginning of high school, most boys described close friendships, that's the title of this movie, Close, with another boy, in which they shared deep secrets. And the boys would say, if you don't have someone to tell your secrets to, you would go wacko, or you would get angry, or you would be crazy. By the end of high school, 75% of the boys in her study no longer had a best friend. And if they talked about intimacy with another boy, they would preface it by saying, no homo. Because manhood was defined as emotional stoicism and independence. And they would say things like, why do you need someone to tell your secrets to? And, that kind of thing. So what do you want to do? You want to zero in on what your resistance, joining children's healthy resistance, is like building up their immune system. Boys in kindergarten, girls in middle school, 7th grade, right at that time, and then boys again in the later years of high school. That's where you would focus your efforts.
So I think we have time for one more question, and this also speaks a bit to where do we go from here? So last time you spoke here at JTS in this space, the discussion was titled Listening, Love, and Citizenship, Healing the Fractures in American Society. We're a week away from another election in this country, and civil discourse has been deteriorating for several years now. So what's your advice for how we can heal discourse in this country?
I was going to say, we haven't even talked about what happened in Israel with the election. It's such a searing question right now. I mean, it's so appalling what has happened to discourse. It's funny because in my class yesterday on listening, I felt that I saw how cancel culture was interfering with my students' ability to engage with the people they were interviewing. I mean, even to be curious, to listen to them. I mean, there's a phrase I teach in teaching listening, which is, notice what happens when you replace judgment with curiosity. I mean, that's the key to discovery. But it's like the wall of judgment was so so high, and the fear of judging, so that the sense is that the students had turned themselves into being like tape recorders. They couldn't say anything. They couldn't hear what they were hearing and engage with it for fear of judging and being canceled or canceling or something. I mean, I really felt it was the first time that really, really struck me. So, I think the answer is obvious. We need to learn how to listen. And the next thing I will write is about radical listening. And by radical, I think this is a good place to end. And why do I speak of radical listening? And I speak of radical listening because the word radical means root. And it means listening that goes to the root. In other words, to be curious about what is being said and also what is not being said. Where is this conversation rooted? What is it sort of emerging out of, this particular conversation? What is being said? What isn't being said? But radical also means holding a potential for transformation. And if you're really listening, which is more of a challenge, because that means opening myself to your worldview and your experience, really taking into myself your voice, which could really unsettle or destabilize things that I may hold very dear or so forth. But it also means opening myself to the possibility of being changed by what I hear from you. So it seems to me that, again, it's about listening that's driven. Notice what happens when you replace judgment with curiosity. And also, what does it take? And I mean, I think we actually know something about this. What does it take to open myself to the possibility of change, of actually being, so I'm not living in a fortress. So I mean, I think in a certain sense the answer is simple and obvious, and on the other hand, it's extremely difficult. And so it takes us back to, how are we educating our children? How are we leading our own lives? I mean, what do we know? How can we do this? But it feels very, very urgent to me right now. Because what is it? The opposite of voice is violence. I mean, and if you don't have equal voice, meaning two people who are listening, you can't solve problems in a relationship. And then you're left with the use of force. And there's been an attack on voice, it seems to me. So that's what I think we need. It's 9:00. We should all go home. But that's the beginning of another conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gilligan. It's been tremendous to be in conversation with you this evening, to listen to you, to ask questions, to engage. And I always tell my students that there's not a period at the end of the conversation, it's a semicolon, and I so much look forward to the continuation through your forthcoming book, In a Human Voice, and also now you've just planted the seeds for all of us to look forward to wisdom and insight and guidance for compassionate and radical listening. So thank you very much. I threw it with them.